Aged Revolt by Bethia Mills of Marimbula 2548. Narrated by Rowena Robinson. The long dry road disappears into the distance. A lone small sedan has its nose wedged into the bank like a bird searching for a hidden worm. Mrs. Gray is looking bewildered, both hands clutching the steering wheel in the 10-2 position. Jason, a red P-plater, guns his engine as he roars past. He glances sideways at the sedan as a thought forms. Wow! Is that car ploughed into the side? Christ, it's an accident! He screeches to a stop. The next day, Mrs. Gray exits the doctor's surgery. "I'm not going back to Dr. John," she firmly states to her daughter, who is guiding Mrs. Gray through the car park. "That Dr. John said I wasn't allowed to drive my dear little car anymore. What does he know? I've been driving for years longer than he has." "Mum, it's for your own safety. You had that turn. Things could have been a lot worse. What if that young chap hadn't come along? You might have been stuck there for hours." "Fiddle, fiddle. I'm as strong as an ox," Mrs. Gray asserts as she hurries to get ahead of her daughter. A few weeks later, Mrs. Gray moves into a retirement village. Her daughter rushes around organizing everything: brand new bed, a new reclining chair which is strategically placed so Mrs. Gray can both watch television or gaze out of the window at the rose garden. "Mum, isn't it great? The perfume wafting in with the roses in bloom." "It's drafty. I'll catch my death." "Why couldn't I have my own lounge? This new chair, it moves when I sit in it. My old one never did that." "Mum, just see how things are after a month. I'm sure you'll be happy here." "I told you, I was quite all right in my own place, with all my own things. Not a bed that one nearly needs a ladder to get into. And what have you done with my dear little car? You haven't sold it behind my back. It's a very reliable car, you know." "No, I haven't sold it yet. Still need it repaired from when you drove into the bank. Anyway, you have to face the fact you can't drive anymore." "I'll go and see a new doctor who will give me back my license, not that Dr. John." Mrs. Gray's daughter rolls her eyes and throws up her hands as she kisses her mum goodbye. Next morning, after a night spent tossing and turning in the new bed, Mrs. Gray calls a taxi to take her into town. "Can you wait? I won't be long," she instructs the driver as she alights at the doctor's surgery. "I need to see a doctor, but not Dr. John," she announces to the receptionist. "Right," the receptionist replies. "Dr. Marish could see you." On the return trip, the taxi driver sees Mrs. Gray wiping tears from her red-rimmed eyes. "Stop here," she calls, as she suddenly notices the blackboard sign outside the local pub. Large letters announce, "Best lunches in town." Entering through the glass-panelled double doors, Mrs. Gray carefully studies the menu. "Steak, medium rare, salad and chips with a pot of tea," Mrs. Gray orders. "Would you like just a half a serve?" offers the waitress. "No," Mrs. Gray emphatically replies. "A normal size, thank you." Mrs. Gray is taking her time ploughing through the large meal when the waitress approaches. "How long can I sit here?" inquires Mrs. Gray. "You can stay as long as you like, dearie. We don't close until 4 o'clock in the morning." "You mean I could stay till 4 a.m.? Mrs. Gray is frowning as she stares at the waitress. "Sure. We don't have a lot of customers after 1 a.m., but the boss says we still have to stay open." That night, at the stroke of midnight, Mrs. Gray calls a taxi. The taxi driver is surprised when Mrs. Gray directs him to drive her to the local pub. At the hotel, Mrs. Gray orders a pot of Earl Grey tea and sits at one of the tables. She hears bells ring and is mesmerized by the flickering lights of the nearby poker machines. By 2 a.m., all the other patrons have gone. She is the only customer left in the hotel. The waitress inquires if Mrs. Gray would like another cup of tea or would she like a taxi ordered. A cup of tea would be lovely. I will stay till closing time, thank you. So this becomes a regular pattern for Mrs. Gray. Generally around midnight, when all is quiet and closed up at the retirement village, Mrs. Gray orders a taxi to transport her to the local hotel. Her time there she spends drinking cups of tea and chatting to the late-night staff. Often she is their only customer from 1 a.m. until closing time. You do make a lovely hot cup of tea, just the way I like it. You are very welcome, the waitress replies as she places the steaming cup on the table in front of Mrs. Gray. Many of the village residents come here for lunch or afternoon tea, but you're not like them. Why visit so late in the night? Mrs. Gray puts her cup back on the saucer, then gives a wicked laugh. This is my revolt against old age. The end.